All right, let's note again what's happening here. Lacan starts with a Borromean link system where all three of these registers of human being, the three Ds, if you will, the three dimensions of human being, hang together. Real, symbolic, and imaginary. They're connected by way of a link. He's now saying that the theory of the subject that emerges from analytic experience is one that presumes in most people that these three registers have been fused together. They are not just connected, they are continuous, he says. It's by way of suture that this continuity is established. And that's what you see on your screen in the diagram we worked up in the last lecture. Those pink dots are like stitching points where things are linked together. And I think it's worth working with here at the start of our 5th lecture in this series on Seminar 23. Now notice this, and here's the real oddity of the thing. We start with 3 Borromean linked rings. They're fused or sutured or spliced together to give us an open trefoil knot, which Lacan says is the singular subjective support for most people. It's a knot of meaning, desire, and enjoyment, which is why you see in the purple open trefoil knot on your screen, sens, little a, and j phi being all roped together in this knot. What Lacan now is going to do is say we need to close this knot. This open knot for many of us is in fact closed. So if you look on your screen, you can see the open trefoil knot has 2 dangling strings, one real and one imaginary. They're labeled as such in the first half of Seminar 23. No news here. What Lacan wants to do now is add a 3rd suture, you can guess where it goes, that effectively knots these 2 dangling strings together. The result is what is called a closed trefoil knot. We're going to get there. We're going to develop the whole thing. You're going to see it step by step. I bring it up here because, weirdly enough, what is at stake for Lacan in thinking through a synthome is not thinking through a connection or a continuity or a closing of a trefoil knot. What he's looking at are points in this process where something goes wrong. The synthome is a repair that is made at any point in this process where something goes wrong. The Borromean link system of symbolic, real, and imaginary, one of them isn't overlaid or underlaid correctly, and it threatens to fall apart. Enter the synthome as a repair. The open trefoil knot that you see on your screen, sometimes that thing is mistied. Enter the synthome as a repair, a way of mending this mistied knot. The same is going to be true as we develop a closed trefoil knot, again in service to a Lacanian theory of the subject for the mid-1970s. The synthome that Lacan is edging towards again and again is there to swoop in where one of these connections, continuities, fusions, links turned knots starts to falter, where something kind of breaks down. So I want you to hold all this in mind. He's moving from a link system to an open knot system to a closed knot system. But in each case, in the back of his mind, he's envisioning the synthome as an additional buckle, link, or knot that could be added at any point to make this system hold together, to keep it, in other words, from falling apart. So with that said, let's get back to work on this trefoil knot. What Lacan is going to do as Seminar 23 develops is he's going to shift from an open trefoil knot to a closed trefoil knot. And the move here is really quite simple. You just add another suture And I will once again do so in pink to keep this diagram consistent. You just have to add one more suture, this time between the imaginary and the real. In so doing, you effectively fuse these links. So I'll shift back to purple to show you that the addition of these sutures between imaginary and real establishes a continuity. Now the real and the imaginary are continuous. They're effectively fused. To symbolize this, you take the dangling bit of the open trefoil knot and connect it to the other dangling bit as I'm doing here on your screen. Now, with the addition of this third suture, you now have a closed trefoil knot, because the two dangling strings, the two, as it were, loose ends, have now been fused together. And now it is a single continuous knot, properly tied with all the overlays and underlays in the correct place. This thing will not come apart. It is a closed trefoil knot that we created by adding one more suture to the mix. Compare the diagrams, for instance, on pages 39, 44, and 58 of the Standard English Translation of Seminar 23, 39, 44, and 58. These are all open trefoil knots. Compare them, however, to the diagram work Lacan is doing at the top of page 71, that famous page 71 from which we read in our last lecture. Look at what he's doing at the top there. He's suggesting that with the addition of this third suture marked C in the Borromean diagram to the left, which is reproduced on your screen here, you can get a closed trefoil knot. There are some issues here which we're going to come to, but for now I just want you to compare the trefoil knot you see on page 71 to the trefoil knots that you see on 39, 44, and 58. By the time we get to 71, Lacan is now thinking about closed trefoil knots. And what I'm trying to show you here is how he arrives at that. He adds a third suture that closes the open trefoil knot that he'd been working with up to that point. Now, we've discussed suture points A and B that you see labeled at the top of page 71. And we can go ahead and just label them here in our diagram. Since some of you might not have the book in front of you, what Lacan is doing is he's saying this is suture point A, where symbolic is sutured to imaginary. This is suture point B, where symbolic is sutured to real. And he's saying this third one, we call it suture point C, just for labeling purposes. A, B, and C, 3 suture points to give you a closed trefoil knot from a 3-part Borromean link system. We've discussed A and B, and we are now looking at suture C. A and B are the 2 suture points that gave us an open trefoil knot in the last lecture. That knot of jouissance we were discussing. Lacan, as ever, now adds a third, here labeled C. Make no mistake, this guy can't resist counting 3. A third which suture or splices the real and the imaginary, tying up those loose ends we just spoke about in the open trefoil knot. The tricky part in all this, I think, is also the most frustrating part in reading the Standard English edition of Seminar 23. The dilemma here is that the closed trefoil knot that emerges from this third suture or tie, as shown at the top of page 71, is incorrect. That is not, in fact, the closed trefoil knot that results from doing the work that Lacan is suggesting with suture points A, B, and C. Take a look at the closed trefoil knot on your screen and compare it to the closed trefoil knot at the top of page 71. The one at the top of page 71 in the Standard English edition of Seminar 23 is wrong. It is upside down, and it is even mislabeled, making it extremely confusing to see the point Lacan is making here, that when you add a third suture, you get a closed trefoil knot that serves as the singular subjective support for the analysand and helps you understand their jouissance, as it were. I don't know how this happened. I didn't edit this volume. I don't know who did. Oh, wait, I know exactly who did. It's labeled on the front of the book. Did the translator do this? I kind of doubt it. In fact, I'm not even quite sure how this editorial error occurred. Just go and consult the French original at Stafferla, and you will see the correct rendering that Lacan offered in his seminar for the closed trefoil knot. Now then compare that to what you see in the Standard English edition, and you'll see exactly the editorial error I'm referring to here. And I'm making a fuss about this for a reason. This is truly a remarkable editorial error at the top of page 71, where you see an upside down and mislabeled closed trefoil knot. Truly remarkable. And one which may be responsible for the dearth of commentary on Lacan's trefoil knot compared to that which exists on his Borromean drawings. If you look at the literature surrounding late Lacan, you see a lot of discussion and treatment of these Borromean threes, symbolic, real, and imaginary, and the links and all that stuff, even around with the synthome. There is a scant amount of that commentary dedicated to the trefoil knot. And I can't help but look at what's happening at the top of page 71 in the Standard English edition and think to myself, this is the reason, this is one of the reasons why we don't see much engagement with the trefoil knot, certainly compared to the Borromean link system. Because in the Standard English edition, that shit is incorrectly presented. You can't look at the diagram on the left of a Borromean system and then envision the one on the right as somehow emerging from those suture points. You have to flip it around, you have to relabel shit, you got to look at this thing totally different. It's too much to ask of a reader. And it's an egregious error because if you just go back and look at the French original, that mistake doesn't occur. Seriously, page 64 of the Stafferla edition of Seminar 23. Go there exactly and you will see. The Borromean system, when sutured up, closes into a trefoil knot that looks like the one in purple on your screen, which is also the one that you see in red in the Stafferla edition, not the one you see in gray in the Standard English edition. There, in the Stafferla, as on your screen here, the closed trefoil knot which emerges from the Borromean linkage when you add a third suture is accurately represented and true to Lacan's thought. Again, I'm not sure why or how it appears differently and downright incorrectly here in the English edition of Seminar 23. But here we are. We are setting the record straight here. And I look forward to having discussions about scholarly rigor in the future regarding stuff like this. Because take any major Western world historical thinker, and you will see a fairly systematized, standardized, and exhaustive treatment of their work. Soren Kierkegaard immediately comes to mind. The Standard English edition of Soren Kierkegaard's collected writings, that means his published books, his newspaper articles, his journal entries, his correspondence, even his notebooks, his drawings. The guy liked to scribble too. You can go to Princeton University Press and you can consult the entire systematic corpus with an elaborate like 600-page index that is its own volume where you can look up, I don't know, wagon wheels. And it will tell you every single spot in Soren Kierkegaard's work where the wagon wheel is discussed. It's just an example. Pick your world historical thinker. Take Aristotle, for instance. There's more secondary scholarship and organized systematicity around Aristotle than there is around the fucking New Testament. My point is this. Lacan is deserving of such a treatment. But as I work through his materials, I don't see that. Now, I wasn't raised in the Lacanian tradition. I was trained as an intellectual historian. I'm just reading the history of Western thought as it appeals to me. We did lectures on Heidegger before we did lectures on Lacan. These are just the ones that took off. I have been surprised, continuously so, by the lack of systematicity, the lack of standardization, hell, the lack of release of Lacan's materials. What is the hold-up? And why, when we do get releases, do we see egregious errors like the one at the top of page 71? Here's the reason why I'm fired up about this. It is hard enough to read Lacan in English, in French, in Spanish. Maybe it's even easier, perhaps a little better even. It is more and more difficult when you have to wade through bullshit editorial errors like this, when you could have just so easily just rendered it according to the French. That is not what we see in the standard English edition of Lacan's works when they appear. We often see highly edited, and in this case, error-prone productions. And I do not blame the translators for these errors, by the way. The translators tend to do a pretty damn good job, if you ask me. But enough about that. We are here doing the work, and this is one of the reasons why we're doing this work. Because Lacan is worth it, he's a world historical thinker, and we're trying to bring some coherence and systematicity to his thought that is loyal to his thought, not to any editorial agenda. So, let's do what we came here to do and continue setting the record straight on these trefoil knots that, according to Lacan, tell us everything we need to know at this point about the Lacanian subject. In other words, let's get back on the trail of that synthome. The first, left side diagram you see on 71 is fine. And exactly as we drew it in our last lecture, which is also what you see on your screen here today. We can ramp up to it one more time with a really quick review. Look at the diagram on your screen. It's the direct rendering of the upper left-hand diagram you see on page 71 of Seminar 23. Here, the symbolic sits atop the imaginary, and the real weaves its way through. Then we add two sutures, here labeled A and B. This gives us our open trefoil knot. It's a knot of meaning, desire, and enjoyment. A knot of jouissance, the one that we've been discussing. But again, it also leaves us with those loose ends, one real and imaginary. So now we introduce splice point C, that sutures those two ends, fuses them together, giving us a closed trefoil knot. The same with which Lacan would go on to theorize the synthome. It is atop the closed trefoil knot that Lacan then starts to build up to the synthome. That is why we're doing this work. It's not just about the theory of the subject that he's developing in the mid-1970s. We are working toward the synthome, and we are following the path that Lacan blazes. It is a path from the Borromean link to an open trefoil knot to a closed trefoil knot to a trefoil knot that is closed but erroneously tied, and thus always threatening to come undone. The synthome is the repair that the subject adds to a false trefoil knot. And here Lacan is working with closed trefoil knots. So I want you to have the diagram in front of you as we start stepping towards this syntho. So that's a lot, right? But I know some of you keep count. Keeping count is a great thing to do at this point. If you're keeping count, notice how this all stacks up. We start with 3 interlocking rings, R, S, I. We then add 2 sutures, A and B, allowing for a +1 of sorts, here as an open trefoil knot. At which point Lacan invites us to add a 3rd suture, here labeled C, transforming this +1 into yet another, here a closed trefoil knot. Add it all up. We've got 3 rings, 3 sutures, 2 knots along the way, and each serving as a certain subjective support. We start with 3. Hear me now. There ain't no doubt about it. We start with 3. That hasn't changed. But who knows where the count ends? That's the key point here. We are dealing with 3+ at this point. And it's a +1, a +1, a +1, a +1. It just keeps popping. Suture, a top splice, a top suture, a top artifice. Open knot, a top closed knot that comes unfurled, which introduces another +1 in the form of the synthum. You see the count as we're unfolding it here, right? Keep counting with me. We're going to get to the bottom of this. But Lord, not without feeling like Lacan is every bit the Wizard of Oz in this business, man. You've heard of lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. At this point, midway through Seminar 23, I'm feeling circles, sutures, and knots. Oh my. Listen though, whether we're talking about an open or a closed trefoil knot, Lacan's point is still the same. In most people, this is how real, symbolic, and imaginary modes of being hang together, so tightly as to become continuous as a trefoil knot made from a single strand of string, here colored purple. Emphasis, though, on the word most. Most does not mean all. Most people is another way of saying not all people. Most people, in other words, means not everyone. Thus, to put it plainly, not everyone experiences connection to the point of continuity between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Most people do, but not all do. Not everyone has a proper trefoil knot, open or closed, as their subjective support. In some people, the trefoil knot they experience is false, which is to say damaged, mistaken, mistied, and destined to come undone, unknotted, causing it to spring back and open up into, of all things, a ring shape. A false or mistied trefoil knot springs back, springs open, it comes unknotted and leaves you with a circle, a ring. Put that in your pipe. Like a Bromian link, if any overlay or underlay of a trefoil knot is incorrect, the whole thing comes apart, which is precisely what drew Lacan to James Joyce. This is how we get to Joyce. In Joyce, Lacan sees someone whose underlying subjective trefoil knot keeps coming undone, or at least threatening to come undone. And in Joyce's art, particularly his later writings, Lacan sees a way to make up for this, effectively mending the Irishman's underlying trefoil knot, and beyond it, his fraught Borromean links. So let's take Lacan at his word and ask a few questions here. What happened with James Joyce? Why? How was his psychic knot mistied? And what did Joyce do to make up for this? What exactly did Joyce do to mend his mistied trefoil knot of subjectivity? How did he mend his psychic knot? I want to take these questions one at a time because each brings us one step closer to the synthome. We move slow, but when we get where we're headed, rest assured we have arrived. The question of what happened to Joyce, such that his psychic knot was mistied, can be better asked. Let me say it again. Say it better this time. The real question here is what did not happen to Joyce, causing his psychic knot to be mistied? What didn't occur in his youth? Answer: castration. But it's a bit more complicated than this as ever, dear Lacanians. Recall, for instance, the first flourish of Seminar 23 in Lesson 1, right at the start of our text. The synthome, Lacan tells us on page 5, starts with a sin, an original sin, which opens up a fault line that doesn't stop growing unless it undergoes the stop of castration, even if only as possible. Straight from page 5 of our text. Joyce, we are wagering here, didn't experience this stop or sense it as a possibility even. His castration was a failure. Why? Why was Joyce's castration a failure? Because his father was a failure. Because his father, according to Lacan, was never a father for him. Not only did he teach him nothing, Lacan says, but he neglected pretty much everything. Paternal abdication. This is all Joyce received from his father. And mind you, it is all Joyce ever returned to him. Long before he developed a synthome, the argument goes, Joyce had this paternal failing as the origin of a certain symptom. Note this, before he came up with a synthome that was the totality of his written art, especially at the end, he had a certain symptom. Lacan is outspoken here, and it's worth noting. Joyce has a symptom that starts off from the fact that his father was a failing father, a radically failing father. He speaks of nothing but that. Direct quote from page 77 of our text. We can check out page 55 as well for a good bit of clarity here. I'll read you the last sentence of A Portrait of an Artist, Lacan says. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. He addresses this prayer to his father, a father who distinguishes himself precisely as, as what we might call an unworthy father, a failing father, the one whom throughout Ulysses he will seek in the guise of he who is not to be found at any level whatsoever. Ulysses is the testimony of how Joyce remains deeply rooted in his father while still disowning him. That's precisely what his symptom is. Suffice it to say, my friends, if Joyce's psychic knot is botched, as Lacan puts it here, it's because his father was even more so. If the sin which occasioned Joyce's synthome was original, it's because it was that of the father, of his father, of Joyce's father. This was the fault, the sin with which Joyce's synthome began, sending Joyce off on a lifelong search for the stop of castration, hell, even the possibility of the stop of castration, a stop which would keep his psychic fault line from growing any further, just as Lacan wagers on page 5. Note the emphasis on possibility here. It's worth dwelling on for a minute. But also remembering what I've always told you about Lacan when it comes to modal philosophy. The possible is a modality from Aristotelian modal philosophy forward. Whenever Lacan starts messing with modal thought, we have to be kind of careful here. He's a smart fellow, don't get me wrong, but less so when it comes to modal thought. We saw this in Seminar 19b, and we've been seeing it ever since. Here, though, at the start of Seminar 23, I think Lacan is on to something. I quote, again from page 5 of Seminar 23, "The possible is what stops, being written, or rather what would stop taking the path of being written." It's initially a wording that probably struck you as something you would love to ignore. But there's actually something really profound happening here around the possibility of castration. Lacan is here suggesting that even the possibility of castration, if written out, if put on the page, if fixed in ink, set in type, stone even, perhaps, you might think, as a series of novels about just that, a series of novels about the possibility of castration. Lacan is suggesting that the possibility of castration, when written down, is sufficient to do the work of castration, allowing for something which stops someone's psychic fault line from growing. This raises a rather technical question, a question we can now begin to ask, even if we are still unable to answer it fully. Is the symptom a one-and-done event or formation? Or is it something that must be continually repeated in the life of the subject? In other words, does the synthome close the loop of castration once and for all? Or is the synthome a knot that must be continually retied? Or if you want to put it even a little bit more precisely, and I'm inclined to do so because let me tell you, the first live online discussion we had on Friday, folks were on fire, and this is as precisely as they were thinking. If you're liking these lectures, but you're not joining us for the discussions, you are missing out. Too many people, but it's great to have this many people because everybody gets a chance to sit back and think and be as precise as they want. We've got clinicians, scholars, independent learners, students, trainees from all over the world showing up to work these materials. And let me tell you, some of these folks are smart as hell. And they're thinking, as precise as we can get. So here is my tribute to them. Let me try and be as precise here as I know they are there. Is the synthome an effect or is it an event? Is it a formation or is it an operation? And if the latter, if it is an event, if it is an operation, is its logic one of repetition? Repetition of a certain knot tying in service to the possibility of castration. A pursuit of this possibility that is in itself sufficient to do some provisional yet effective castrative work. Joyce, as read by Lacan, seems to suggest the latter. His synthome doesn't appear in one place, one book, one passage, once and for all. Instead, Joyce's synthome is everywhere. It's all over his work. It's in every chapter, multiple places in a single sentence even, if you're reading his later work. Pick a passage, damn near any passage in Finnegan's Wake, and you'll see what I mean. Joyce's synthome is a rolling synthome, ever on the move from one word or phrase to the next, en route to what each makes possible, castration. A knot, in other words, that will not come untied. This is what Lacan means, or at least suggests when he says, it's the synthome rule, the rolling synthome, on rollers that Joyce conjoins. Again, right at the start of Seminar 23, page 6. Joyce's synthome is a rolling synthome, a synthome on rollers. In fact, as Lacan sees it, this is precisely how Joyce understood his task as an author: to keep generations of readers rolling from one line to the next and back again. Meet me on page 72 for some further evidence of this. Lacan asks, why not conceive of the case of Joyce in the following terms? Isn't his desire to be an artist who would keep the whole world busy, or in any case, as many people as possible, what compensates exactly for the fact that, let's say, his father was never a father for him? If we join Lacan in this inquiry, I think we can use his work in Seminar 23 to also sharpen this inquiry quite a bit. Let's see if we can be a bit more precise with all of this daddy business. The synthome for James Joyce was a supplement, or better, a guarantor, of the phallus that his father failed to transmit to him. Joyce's castration failed because his father failed, and his father's primary failure, I'm telling you, was his failure to transmit the phallus to his son. That is how I read Lacan's analysis of Joyce. And to provide just a bit more evidence so you know I'm not making this shit up, to flesh out, as it were, this phallic issue, notice how Lacan once more returns to Freud. Page 69 is a good one for this. Freud makes some great appearances, but 69, as it were, is the best. Freud was very alert to something that is a great deal older than the Christian mythology, namely castration. Castration means that the phallus is transmitted from father to son. And this even entails something that cancels out the father's phallus before the son has any right to bear it. Freud refers to the idea of castration essentially in this manner, where castration is a transmission that is plainly symbolic. And if you want to be even more dirty, gritty, and wondrous with this stuff about the phallus, recall where Lacan began this phallic turn in Seminar 23. It's on page 7. And I hope you see the theme here. Pages 5, 6, and 7 are fire. Listen to this one. Or don't. Plug your ears for the next 15 seconds if you don't want the grit and dirt and wonder of this phallic turn. Since his dick was a bit lax, as it were, his art supplemented for his phallic allure. And this is always the way. The phallus is the conjunction between what I have called this parasite, which is the little scrap of a dick in question, and the function of speech. And it is in this respect that his art is the true guarantor of his phallus. Now, I know you didn't plug your ears. I know you heard that. But did you hear it with your eyes? Did you hear it with your eyes while staring at the diagram on the screen in front of you? Show me the phallus on the screen in front of you. Notice where you see it. Between the symbolic and the real. Between the realm of speech and the realm of flesh scraps. Real dicks, if you want to be that way about it. I ask you to focus also on the word parasite here. Phallic enjoyment is parasitic jouissance, Lacan tells us in Seminar 23. I don't think we quite know what that means yet. I certainly don't. Maybe you've got it all figured out. Let's see if we can get there. Put a pin in this one. Remember page 7 for just this reason. So here we've got it. The phallus, the symbolic, and now speech, all centered on a certain paternal failure, a certain failure of castration, a certain failure to stop one's psychic fault line from growing. What on earth was Joyce to do in these circumstances? And remember once more, it's the symptom more than the symptom that we are after here. We're not looking at what ails poor Joyce on its own, what's not working out for him. Joyce as symptom is just the start of our inquiry. What we're interested in here is what allows Joyce to make up for this symptom, to make up for what ails him, to make up for what's not working out in his life. What allows him to make up for all this? What allows him to mend his fraught relation to the phallus, the symbolic, speech, and more broadly, language? Joyce's problem is a symbolic problem. It's a linguistic problem. How does he fix it? We know what his symptom is. We know what ails the poor guy. How does he repair? How does he recover? This is a question that puts us off the symptom and onto the symptom. Let's ask it more precisely in fidelity to Joyce's work. Where exactly do we see the art of James Joyce, his writing, allowing for the possibility of a certain stop, here the stop of castration? Where, in other words, do we see his symptom at work, rolling right along? a clue comes to us at the end of Lesson 3 in Seminar 23. The synthome, Lacan tells us, often involves a specific term or type of term that's attached to the unconscious in a truly peculiar way, giving us what Lacan calls a glimpse of what's involved in there, in the unconscious. For Joyce, this term, or this type of term, that is attached to his unconscious in a peculiar way, and which gives us a glimpse into what his unconscious involves, is the proper noun. Specifically, you guessed it, the name. And one name more than any other, his own. The specific term that is attached in a peculiar way to Joyce's unconscious is the riddle of his own name. It was in wanting a name for himself that Joyce came up with a compensation for the paternal failing, Lacan says. I think this is why Lacan emphasizes the word calling at the end of Lesson 5 in Seminar 23. This part is key. It's a terrific little breadcrumb on the path we're walking here. Joyce's calling to be a writer was more precisely to determine what to call himself, and thus arrive at what his father failed to give him, in the castrative sense, a proper name. Joyce's calling is definitely to write, but the question at the center of his calling is, what am I to be called? Where the name of the father failed, Joyce would write his own again and again. And not just for himself and his own psychic fault line, but also, here is Joyce's conceit, for the rest of us, for his readers, for us to honor, respect, and puzzle through without end, in a line of bewilderment that extends to infinity. Notice how Lacan ramps up to this line which extends to infinity, a line, in short, of homage. Page 72 to 73 of our text is where I'm headed. If you've got the book in front of you, meet me there. Is there not something along the lines of a compensation for this paternal abdication, this de facto Verwerfung, in the fact that Joyce felt himself to have imperiously received his calling? This is a word that results from a whole stack of things to be found in what he wrote. It is the specific mainspring by which the proper noun is something strange in Joyce. The name that is proper to him is what Joyce valorizes at the expense of his father. It is to this name that he wanted homage to be paid, a homage that he refused to anyone else. I think that last part is very revealing and spot on. Not only did Joyce want a name to which all would pay homage, he wanted this homage to be paid at the expense of anybody else's name. It was his name, and no other, that Joyce wanted us to honor, respect, and puzzle through without end. Hear me now. The oddity that was the proper noun at the level of the name that Joyce was searching for himself centered on his search for a name that would stand all alone, a name by itself. This is what Joyce sought. A name all alone, which Lacan identifies as his synthome. This is what Lacan means in the passage we just read at the end of Lesson 5, when he goes on to suggest, you can check it out yourself, that Joyce wanted his name to be more than a master signifier, more than an S1, and thus beyond, unrivaled by any other. I'll read it for you. It's on page 73, just where we left off. It is in this respect that one is able to say that the proper noun does all it can to make itself more than the S1, the master signifier, which heads toward the S that I have labeled with the index of a subscript 2, which is that around which the gist of knowledge accumulates. And then there is a diagram showing S1 with an arrow pointed at S2. That S2 is the S that Lacan has labeled with the index of a subscript 2. He's saying S2 there. Joyce is searching for an S1 that doesn't have an arrow pointed to another. No other signifier. There is no S2 for the name that Joyce seeks. This is not a master signifier. This is a master signifier plus. Something beyond the master signifier, an S1 all alone. I think we're into some deep water at this point. An S1 beyond, unrivaled by any other? All of this suggests to me, and you have to remember, we're only halfway through Seminar 23. We're just making sense of what's in front of us. But if we just start there with the first half of Seminar 23, I think we can suggest this. Whatever constitutes somebody's synthome, it's going to be something singular, unique, and strangely tied to their unconscious, without in turn allowing for dialectization in language, knowledge, and the like. You can hear Lacan working up to a notion of the synthome that doesn't pop up in analysis the way a regular S1 qua symptom pops up in analysis. And if you want to really just think with this for a second, draw out the analytic discourse. What is produced in the analytic discourse is an S1. We have theorized that as the symptom. Working with a neurotic would involve hystericizing them around that symptom, which allows the analytic discourse to take a quarter turn backward and become the discourse of the hysteric, where you now see the analysand interrogating their S1 and dialectizing it with an S2. S2 here being unconscious truth. The unconscious truth which commanded that symptom through the hystericization of a neurotic allows for a certain arrow to be drawn, a vector, a connection between that symptom and the unconscious truth that commanded it, that S1 and a certain S2. So it goes with neurotic symptoms. They are produced in the analytic discourse. Then by hystericization, the analysand interrogates those symptoms and realizes them in the context of broader unconscious truths. Oh my gosh, so that's why the guy in my dreams always has a mustache. You see where I'm going with this, right? That is not what Lacan is suggesting a synthome allows. It is an S1 that you can't dialectize. There's no context in which to put this thing. There's no S2 that it can link up with. A synthome in this sense is singular. It is unique. Its tie to the unconscious is so peculiar as to make this term for each of us, for most of us, something singular, which cannot be dialectized away, cannot be contextualized. You can't hystericize that shit into knowledge. It doesn't lend itself, in other words, to interpretation. A synthome, Lacan is here suggesting, he hasn't come out and said it directly yet, it defies analysis. Here, we are dealing with an S1 that doesn't link up with an S2 in or beyond the clinic. So, what again was this for James Joyce? What was this S1 that didn't link up with an S2 for him? What was the proper name that served as his synthome? Where is this brother's S1 without an S2? Again, note where Lacan goes at the end of Lesson 5. That Joyce was also called James, he says, links up in a succession only with the use of the alias, James Joyce, also known as Daedalus. Stephen Daedalus, to be exact, the central fictional character in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the title of which really says it all, but also in Ulysses, which is the central text in Seminar 23 that Lacan considers from Joyce's work. Stephen Daedalus, the alias for James Joyce, the name, the S1 without an S2, according to Lacan. Stephen, if you read Ulysses, if you listen to Ulysses, listening to it's way better than reading it. Talk about an audiobook that needs to be in everybody's headphones. If I'm not mistaken, there's an Irish acting troupe that went through and read Ulysses in a performative sense. It's wherever you get your podcasts. Each chapter is its own theatrical performance. Pop your headphones in and listen to that shit for a minute. Stephen, you will discover, is many things. But above all else, Stephen Daedalus is an aspiring artist. His is a constant struggle to forge a singular, unique, independent, artistic identity. Make no mistake here. Daedalus's lifelong search for artistic authority, from A Portrait to Ulysses, is a search for what his father failed to give him, a phallus worth its weight, a name deserving of homage. You get the idea, right? And if your mind, like mine, hears the name Daedalus and thinks Greek mythology before it thinks the work of James Joyce, just let your mind go there. Let this be your permission structure. Who in the fuck was Daedalus in Greek mythology? Not surprising, Daedalus was a master craftsman, a builder of intricate structures, most famously the labyrinth, the ultimate artifice. An artifice in which he then finds himself trapped, requiring another intricate build, one you've probably heard before. This time, to escape, Daedalus has to build wings. He builds wings from wax and feathers. But his flight from the labyrinth, like Stephen's flight from Ireland, is nothing if not fraught. Successful, yes, sort of. If you call that success, sorry about you, Icarus. But let's get back to Lacan's reading of Joyce, which so far hasn't said a damn thing about Greek mythology. Specifically, let's look at Joyce as Stephen Daedalus. Page 53 is where the action begins. As ever, you don't need the book. I'm happy to read it for you here. Stephen, Lacan says, is the Joyce that Joyce dreams up. And since Joyce is no fool, he doesn't adore him. Far from it. He just has to mention Stephen and he breaks out in a snigger. This is not far removed from my stance when I speak to you about myself, or in any case, about my prate to you. Of what, then, do riddles consist? Riddling is an art that I shall call an art between the lines, thereby alluding to the chord. I don't see why the lines of what is written should not be tied by a second chord. Whoa, hold up. Riddles? What have riddles got to do with all of this? 1 minute Lacan's talking about Joyce as Stephen Daedalus, then he's talking about himself as also performing a certain snigger when he talks about himself, or at least his prate to the audience. And then, boom, he's into riddles. How on earth are we getting from Joyce and Stephen Daedalus, his alias, his S1, to riddles? Read on and you'll see. Page 54, toward the bottom. Stephen is Joyce insofar as he deciphers his own riddle. He doesn't get far because he believes in all his symptoms. This is very striking. He begins by believing in his race. When it comes to his beginnings, in fact, he started long before, sputtering out a few bits and pieces, even poems, and it's not the best stuff he came up with. But my word, he believed in such things as the uncreated conscience of my race. You find that at the end of a portrait of the artist as a young man. It's plain to see that this doesn't reach very far. It ends well, though. I'll read you the last sentence of A Portrait of an Artist. You see, I made a slip because he reckoned himself to be the artist. And now here's the passage that you heard in the last lecture. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. He addresses this prayer to his father, a father who distinguishes himself precisely as, I don't know, as what we might call an unworthy father, a failing father, the one whom throughout Ulysses he will seek in the guise of he who is not to be found at any level whatsoever. Clearly there is a father somewhere, and that is Bloom, another character. A father who is trying to find himself a son, but Stephen protests that it's not really for him. After the father I've had my fill. No more father, especially given that the Bloom in question is not so very tempting. Now, you think that didn't help. I agree, that didn't help much. What is the goddamn riddle that we're talking about here? What is the riddle of one's self that Joyce unravels via Stephen Daedalus and all this business about Father, the old artificer? It is the very same riddle we've discussed before, just a few pages past this particular reading on page 57, the riddle which brings Lacan back to psychoanalysis as a response to certain riddles, a response which sutures, splices, and knots, all by way of artifice. and all in service to jouissance. Here's the riddle, once more in case you missed it. The cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. 'Tis time for this poor soul to go to heaven. And if you're wondering about the analyst's response, if you missed it the last time around, here it is. You're going to love this. The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. Repeat after me, even if you missed the last lecture in this series. Repeat after me, after Lacan, after Joyce. The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. And in repeating this, let me ask you, who said anything about the father?